Today we'll be talking about die forming, conforming and non-conforming dies, how to make the die, and then how to actually form the metal using a hydraulic press. I'll also be providing you with resources in the YouTube video. If you scroll down into the content, you'll have access to the PDFs of the handouts that are also available on Canvas. So what is die forming? Die forming is pressing a nice soft annealed metal into a matrix of some kind. This saves a lot of time in making things wrought by hand over and over again to generate a nice hollow form. So you're creating a matrix or a mold, and then you're conforming or pushing or forming the metal into that mold to make repetitive patterns over and over again. As you can imagine, this is used a lot in industry, and now we can use it in making production work or just reproducing something efficiently and effectively to make consistent volumes of varying depths. All right, so let's get started with die forming. What are you going to need? You are going to need to reference this Boxes and Lockets book. This is on the table in the demo room or the where all the samples are. Do not remove this book from the room during this project because everybody is going to need to reference it, and we only have one copy. This book is out of print, but if you can find it, I do recommend it. It's currently being scanned so that I can provide you with a full PDF version of this book, and then I also have scanned the most relevant information as a handout in your Canvas. So this is a really great reference book, and we're going to be starting on page 30 for this video. You're also going to need a piece of acrylic sheet. 1/4 inch is really good for this. If you don't want to go too deep, if your plan isn't for the die to go really, really deep, you can use 1/4 inch. You can also take 2 layers of 1/4 inch and adhere them together or fuse them together with acro weld. Or you could just start off right off the bat with a nice 3/8 or 1/2 inch piece of plexi. The goal here is to have a deep enough recess for the metal to go into. So if you want to have deep pressed in metal, then you have to have a deeper die. There's ways of sort of manipulating this by not having to cut out a really thick piece, but you're definitely going to have to start out with a nice piece of acrylic sheet that's big enough for your piece, and we'll talk about what big enough means in a second. The other thing you're going to need is really clean and annealed metal. So copper works best for this. Anywhere between 22 and 18 gauge can work. I would not go thicker for die forming. And if you go thinner, the metal tends to buckle and does not form as well. But this is a pretty good process to do with that nice range of 22 to 18. You can't go as deep with 22. There are some limitations there. The metal could break or split. The other thing you're going to need is your safety glasses, of course, and your handouts. Make sure you have these available to you while you're die forming. The handouts that we're going to go over today are the Gnoskin project based handouts, and they're going to talk about actually assembling your own hydraulic press if you wanted to. It gets that detailed. And then we're also going to talk about different kinds of dies with that handout as well. Then the other handout that's really good is just the handout that's called Using a Hydraulic Press. That one's just going to go basic overview of the benefits of die forming and basics of hydraulic press. The other one is the handout from the Boxes and Lockets book that goes over conforming and non-conforming dies. So we're going to talk a little bit about what conforming and non-conforming dies are. And the other one is just called hydraulic press, and it's written with bold Sharpie on the top of the handout. So there's 4 handouts that I'm going to be referencing, and you should have those available to you while you're doing this and while you're cutting out your die. There are 2 kinds of dies that you can use. The die is the matrix or the form that you use to press your metal into to make these replicated forms. You already have some experience with dies, and this is a really good example of a conforming die. So a conforming die is exactly the same with the female end and the male end. So these are industry terms, but the female end and the male end make the exact same shape, given a little bit of variance for the material, the metal that's going to go inside of there. But basically, you know exactly what the shape is going to be on the inside and the outside because it conforms perfectly. Other examples of conforming dies are these DevCon dies, where you have an exact positive and negative, and you press the metal into them. So to create these, you're using basically like a metal epoxy or a two-part epoxy resin that goes inside these steel pipes, basically. And then the metal conforms perfectly to that shape on the positive and the negative. There's a lot of variations of these conforming dies, and they're primarily used in industry to reproduce. The two-part epoxy, is a little bit more of a nasty chemical. Here's a really good example of a conforming dye that you could just reproduce over and over and over again. So, when we're making molds, basically, that's what this is. We're thinking about what the positive looks like and what the negative looks like. Here's an example of using a plaster, there we go, plaster positive to create the negative that we're looking for when we're going to form metal. And this is absolutely possible to do. You're going to need the positive no matter what in order to form the piece, but this could be carved out of clay or plastic or 3D printed, and then a conforming die can be created from that. And then you would just have to create the positive to go inside of there. This is pretty deep for metal, but you could maybe do it. I've seen it. So if you want to get that ambitious, a two-part epoxy is going to be the only way to do that. But what we're going to focus on is making non-conforming dies. So we have conforming dies and non-conforming. Both have that trigger word, right? Forming. We're forming metal. We're pushing metal into a shape. But what we're going to be using, like I said, is non-conforming dies. Sometimes it's called silhouette dies because it literally is just a silhouette. So it's just one shape that is cut out of something like acrylic sheet or Lexan, something a little bit stronger. So we have thick materials, as I showed you, and thinner materials that you can choose from. You can also layer them up. So that this one, for example, has two pieces that are adhered. Actually, it looks like they're just glued together with some super glue and some tape. But this one is fused together with that acro weld to make a thicker piece. So silhouette dies are just that, right? It gives you the silhouette of the shape that you're cutting out, and then we're pressing with urethane rubber, which is stronger than regular rubber, the urethane, and it basically moves and presses into the silhouette or that prescribed space that we've given it. By applying a lot of pressure with a hydraulic press, it pushes the urethane into the die and forms your metal. So you can also use non-conforming dies with a hammer. You can take the metal and attach it down. You could super glue it down. You could attach it with screws onto your non-conforming die and hammer it into the die. It's the same principle as this, using this as a die, a conforming die. It's the same principle except for we have no bottom here. So it can be any depth that you want. If you just keep stacking and stacking and stacking this, it can be any depth. If you stack different shapes together too, that would affect the way the metal moves inside of the die as well. So non-conforming dies allow for a lot more flexibility. So you could make somewhat customized pieces with using the same silhouette by just modifying it slightly. So a non-conforming die gives you a lot more latitude, a lot more flexibility with a little less or just a little bit more work, but creates a lot of variety. And the options beyond that also include adding pieces inside of the non-conforming die to manipulate it even more. You could add found objects into the die. There's a lot more options with the non-conforming or silhouette die. The trick is having enough material around the die material. So you don't want to cut things too close to the edge. If you cut things too close to the edge, like this one, you risk breaking or cracking this dye material. It's just acrylic, and we're putting it under, 10,000 pounds. So in a hydraulic press. So, or hitting with a hammer. You can imagine this is a really weak joint if you started whacking on this with a hammer. So you want to make sure that your die has plenty of material around the outside of it. And a good rule of thumb is anywhere between 3/4 and an inch on all sides of your die. It allows for the material of the die, the silhouette material, to retain its strength and not crack under all that pressure. So when you're picking out some of your scraps here, make sure that you're planning your die to be somewhere centered in the middle that allows you to have at least a 1/2 inch or at least 3/4 to an inch around your shape to support the die, to support the structure. So this is another good example, although it was sort of made poorly, of having plenty of material around. And this is a die that's going to last a really long time. Dies can wear out. And they can go bad over time if you don't make them properly. The best way to ensure that you have a die that can produce thousands of die-formed pieces is to make it out of really thick material. The thick material is strong, it displaces the weight properly, and it just allows you to have to make a tool that's going to last a really long time. So picking the right material for your design is going to be really important. And not finding compromising shapes that you're designing in. Dies, these silhouette dies work best when they're a more simple silhouette and not very complex with pieces jutting off. The metal has to be pushed into those places, but it also could risk breaking off. This is, I think, the most extreme I would do on a piece of only 1/4 inch acrylic, and this piece could break off over time. So, basic silhouettes, basic shapes are going to be a die that's going to last a really long time. You also have to remember that you're pushing metal into this negative space. So as you're pushing the metal in, you want to make sure that nothing can get caught on the die, that the metal's not going to get stuck and be hard to pull out, that it can't get hung up on anything. So I'm going to show you how to do basic drilling on the acrylic and cutting out a basic shape, and then filing and sanding and prepping your acrylic so that you can use it properly and have a nice long-lasting die. Okay, when cutting out your acrylic, you're going to want to make sure that you're using a respirator of some kind. So you want to make sure that you're protecting yourself from the dangerous fumes of this plastic that's going to be drilled and then pierced out with your jeweler's saw. We're going to be using a wax blade. So it's a blade that we primarily use for wax that is spiraled and has tines or teeth still pointing down, but it's a spiraled blade, and it's used. It's really great for cutting things like this out. So we're going to go ahead and drill while wearing a mask, and then begin our cutting process. While you're drilling this, the material can melt, and it will melt while you're also sawing the material. So you'll get, sometimes your drill bit will get stuck, or sometimes your saw blade will get stuck, and that's because the plastic is heating up because of either the rotary tools that you're using, or because of the just the pace of your sawing. So again, I'm going to be using my jeweler's saw with a spiral saw blade, and I'll cut this out. Okay, so I sawed this out with my spiral saw blade here. which is used for wax sometimes too. It has a pretty aggressive kerf, so it removes about a 1/16 of an inch out, maybe a little less than a 1/16 out. So you use your spiral saw blade, and you still have the teeth in a downward facing direction. And I'll have a couple of these out for you, but anybody that took casting probably has their blade, so please use that one to minimize waste. But I've had the same spiral saw blade for like 10 years now. They just don't go bad usually. So this die was cut out and then filed and sanded to remove any sharp edges to make sure it doesn't get hung up on the metal or rip the metal. The last thing you would want is to rip your metal every single time you'd form with this die. The other thing I did was make it nice and smooth inside, because that's the texture that the metal is going to pick up on, is the texture of the die itself. So you want to make sure not to change the shape. And one thing to be careful of when you're cutting the die is to make sure you're cutting perpendicular. If you're not cutting perpendicular and you have the saw at an angle this way or this way, then your die isn't going to be perfectly perpendicular. And it might actually change in size from this side to this side, which if you're making something like a locket can be super problematic. If you have an asymmetrical shape that looks like this, and you wanted to make a locket, you would have to die form from this direction, and then in order to have the exact same shape on the other side, mirroring it, you'd have to flip the die over and then die form the other piece from this direction. So that means that between these two sides, from the top or the bottom, they have to be the exact same size if you want them to be mirror images of each other. So you want to be really careful when you're sawing to make sure that you're exactly perpendicular and you're not tilting the saw blade from side to side when you're cutting this. So on symmetrical shapes, you can just die form the same shape over and over again, and then they would match each other. But if it's an asymmetrical shape, then you have to flip the die to have a mirror image so that they assemble together like a locket. So now that I have my die, it's all sanded, smooth, and the edges aren't going to get hung up on, I can go ahead and start die forming immediately. This is a hydraulic press. We die form just with our arms, right, by hammering things in. We can also die form using a hydraulic press. A hydraulic press is comprised of a plate on top, a frame that holds the whole structure in, and then our ram. Our ram is basically kind of like a bottle jack that comes with your car, and we're going to pump the ram up with this little pump until the ram raises high enough to start compressing our pieces inside of here. As you can see here, this is a pretty big distance here. So we're actually going to pad this. It's important not to bottom out this ram. This ram is only so long. So as it comes out of the jack, it only has so much room before it hits the top plate. We never want to max this out. It's dangerous for the jack. The jack is under a lot of pressure, and it's just unnecessary. So what we end up doing is we end up putting a lot more layers of material so that the ram doesn't have to work so hard. This maintains the longevity of the tool, but it also is a safer way of working with the tool. So for our purposes, we have a piece of regular rubber that we're going to put down. The platen here, the platen is what's attached to the ram. Has a plate that's secured onto it somehow. I don't know how. It's a Pepe regular like steel striking plate. And then I'm just going to put some rubber down. This normal everyday piece of like a compressed recycled rubber is just going to hang on to my silhouette die so that it doesn't move around or shake around because this is going to be under a lot of pressure. So it's sort of like slipping on a slippery surface. If this is under a lot of pressure and things aren't spaced evenly in here, they could slip out from the platen. So I'm just going to put a little piece of rubber down first. Then I'm going to put my die down onto the rubber. And it's really important, super, super important, to make sure that the die is spaced evenly on the hydraulic press. So I'm going to roll you over here. And I want you to see how evenly this is spaced out. So the goal here is to make sure that there's equal distance on either side, that it's relatively spaced and even. And then I also want to check it from this side and make sure it's nice and straight from this side too. So you're checking it from both angles to make sure that the die is perfectly spaced in the middle of the platen and the top plate. There's another 6 by 6 inch plate here. You could assume that 6 by 6 inches is the max for this, but it's actually not. You can have metal that hangs off and then press it in and press it in and press it in, and then make a longer piece if you wanted to, just by shifting every time you form the die. So you would just need a long, big die that is cut in a way that's not going to be compromised by not having support all over. So we can talk about what shapes might not be compromised in that kind of long die. But I have an asymmetrical shape, and I just want to make sure it's spaced evenly on both directions. Then I have my urethane. In the drawer next to the hydraulic press, here we have all of our urethane rubber. In this drawer we have a bunch of different durometers of rubber. We first have a 60 durometer of urethane. We have then these 3 80s. So it's a 1/16 of an inch 80 durometer, a 1/8 inch 80 durometer, and then 1/2 inch 80 durometer. 60 is the softest, and then 80 is a little bit harder. 80 to 95 is pretty standard. That's what is traditionally used exclusively in die forming. I also have a 115 durometer urethane. And urethane, the benefit of urethane over rubber is that rubber compresses. It'll squish down and it won't form or move. So urethane is an optimal material because it doesn't compress. So it'll just form, which is exactly what we want, into the silhouette die. So what is actually happening when the rubber, when we jack up this jack and the urethane rubber goes into the die? What's actually happening is as the pressure increases from the ram being forced up and then maxed out as it hits the top plate, is, if I can get some shininess on here, is the rubber is being pushed into the die. So as you push more and add more and more pressure, the urethane is pushing into the die. And the reason we want to add as many support structures, i.e. like these 3 layers of 80 durometer in here, is because the more support you have, the more even the pressure is. So if I just use this thin one, it would go in and it starts to buckle. If I use the 1/16 of an inch and 1/8 inch with my die, it starts to push it in really evenly. And so with all of that pressure, we want to support it as much as possible, and we don't want to max out the ram. So we want to add add some additional material to give us more height so that we're not maxing this ram out inside of this bottle jack. So after I have my piece of recycled rubber down, I'm going to go ahead and put my die down. And then I'm going to put my annealed metal down. Then I'm going to put the 1/16 of an inch durometer down. And I want to make sure it's perfectly spaced in the middle. Then I'm going to put my 1/8 inch, then my 1/2. And this is another good time to just always evaluate, is this in the center? Is everything lined up perfectly? You want to make sure everything is lined up. If it's not lined up, it'll slip right out of the press. It'll slip this way, it'll slip this way. And then just so I don't have to jack the bottle jack up too much, I'm going to add our nice big thick 1 inch 115 durometer plate on the top. This is going to just give me a little bit more weight so that I'm not sitting here forever trying to jack this thing up. So I'm going to go ahead and start jacking this up. All you have to do is take this little pipe that comes with the jack over here, it's a red pipe, and insert it into the jack pump. This is a hydraulic jack that has hydraulic fluid in it. So what we're doing is building up hydraulic pressure by pumping the jack. And what this is doing is it's pushing up this ram higher and higher. So I'm going to keep pressing until I get close to the plate on top. And this is a 20-ton hydraulic bottle jack. You can buy these, this is a Husky brand, you can buy these at Northern Tool, you can buy them online, and a lot of people make these. A company that has mass produced these things is Bonnie Doon, and so you can buy them pre-made. Okay, so I'm about a 1/4 inch from the top plate. And I'm going to stop right there because I want to reevaluate everything and make sure it is perfectly centered. And the reason we have 6 by 6 inch pieces of urethane is because the top plate is 6 by 6 inches. And it's a really great indicator that everything is just sort of lined up perfectly because everything is 6 by 6 inches. So you want to make sure all of that's lined up, your die is in the middle, the metal hasn't shifted around at all. And this is basically where you're going to be working. This is the zone about 1/4 inch from the top plate is where you're going to be working for the majority of their operation. So if you want to keep going deeper and thicker, then you're going to lock the press into position just like this, and then go ahead and anneal your metal. You'll want to label this so that people don't relieve the pressure on the press because you're going to be annealing and coming back and annealing and coming back. So if you want something really deep, you're probably going to have to anneal a couple times. As you're working it out, depending on the thickness of your metal, depending on how well you annealed it, there's a lot of different variables, depending on how deep you want it. You might have to die form it a couple of times or check in on it as you're pumping to make sure it's the depth that you want. If it's too thin of metal, you do risk sort of cracking it or ripping it at the flange. So basically where the metal forms into the die and where that flange stays on the top of the die. So I'm going to leave it right here, and I'm just going to reevaluate. I'm going to remove all my layers, and I'm just going to reevaluate and make sure my metal is in a perfect sort of position. So this is a really good place to sort of keep it at. It will stay in this location. All the pressure is built up in the jack, and it'll just stay at this position. So I'm going to reevaluate, make sure my metal is the metal I want, make sure it's in the center. You could add a little dab of wax or something to hang on to it if it's going to shift around too much. But this is the only time where the metal's going to shift around. If you want to go deeper with more pressure, the metal will already have an impression in it, and it'll be like locked into place. Okay, now I have my annealed metal, I have my die. I have 2 dies that I'm going to be showing you guys. And after you cut your die or while you're cutting it, be sure to refer to the Use Hydraulic Press handout. It has a bunch of tips for creating your non-conforming die and sort of rules of thumb for what you're looking for when you're cutting your die. It includes directions and reminders about how much material you need on the outside, 1/2 inch to 1 inch. I like to do anywhere between 3/4 and 1, just to make sure that this die is going to last a really long time. We also then have these 2 drawers down here. We have, it says hydraulic press pieces, and then here we have some rubber. Both of these drawers are going to be helpful to you. You might see that all of this rubber is in the drawer like this. And you're going to take it out, make sure it's super clean before you put it away, and super clean after you pull it out, before you start using the hydraulic press. Okay, so now my jack is raised up to a working surface where I don't have to sit there for an hour and jack up the ram. I have my annealed metal with some embossing on it from the rolling mill, which it will distort a little bit, but you definitely, this is the point to consider if you want your detail, your etch surface, your roller printed surface, any texture, if you want it on the inside of the die formed piece or on the outside of the die formed piece. So for my piece, I want the texture on the outside. So that means I'm going to have my silhouette die, and then I'm going to place my annealed metal with the texture facing down, right in the middle. It's a little distorted from rolling this through the mill, but I'm just going to place it right on top as flat as it can be, so that the texture is seen from the inside of the die. This will push it through with all of that urethane piled on top, and then leave my texture undisturbed and on the outside of my die formed piece. So I want to make sure that's directly centered in the middle, And then I'm going to add my 3 layers of 80 durometers, starting with the thinnest layer on the metal. Stack all 3 of these on top and centered. Make sure not to move the metal when you're doing this, and make sure it's centered. This is the only time that you have to worry about the metal shifting around when it's in contact with the die. After this, if you just want to go deeper or you have to re-anneal, the metal will be locked into position. So now I'm going to add my 115 durometer on top. And then since my plate on top is 6 inches by 6 inches, and all of my rubber is 6 inches by 6 inches, I'm going to line it up that way. I'm just going to make sure everything is really, really square. If anything's off center, that's when you get into dangerous territory when it comes to die forming, because things can shift. So I want to make sure everything is really nice and square. I want my die centered, and I want my urethane centered. Okay, now I'm ready to rock and roll. Rock and roll for die forming means I'm going to jack this up a little bit more until I see the rubber compressing. You're going to want to wear your safety glasses at this point, and I'm going to start compressing and adding pressure onto this. We have no gauge on this jack, which is unusual for a hydraulic jack, so we're going to be working on that over the next couple years. But I'm going to be jacking this up until I feel a little bit of resistance. So because I was so close to the top plate, I felt resistance pretty quickly. And now it'll take a little bit more force for me to increase the pressure on this ramp. So now everything is locked in place. It's not moving around because it's already under pressure. This is a good position to be in, because if something slides out, it'll slide out to the side this way or to the slide this way. It won't slide out and hit you in the chest. So you want to make sure you're standing in this position, the location or the direction that the hydraulic press is in. And then I'm going to start jacking it up. I know that I'm going to need quite a bit of pressure to form this and to push and move that rubber into the conforming or the non-conforming die. And I know I want that the piece to be relatively deep. So I'm just going to try it. And this is where note taking is really important. You want to consider what gauge of metal you're using. When you're taking notes, you want to consider how many pumps it took to recreate this over and over again, since we don't have a gauge. So now that I'm in this sort of nice position where everything kind of feels locked in, I'm going to start counting how many pumps it takes to get up to the pressure that I'm imagining, right? So I'm not going to really know until I take the piece out. I'm going to pump 4 times. I'm going to start just with 4 pumps, and what you're going to see is the urethane is going to start to distort a little bit, and it's going to start to buckle on the outsides a little bit. And this is kind of what you want. You want it to buckle, you want it to move, because that means it's also moving inside of that die. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and 1, 2, 3, 4, and you could see slightly it's moving a little bit. And I'm going to go, it didn't move or buckle enough. I'm going to go 2 more, 5, 6, and it's buckling a little bit more. I'm going to go 2 more. 7, 8. Okay, now I feel like it buckled enough for me. So that's 8. This is 22 gauge copper, and I'm going to lower the ram just slightly. I don't want to lower it all the way. If you lower it all the way, then you have to sit there for an hour and crank this thing back up. So to lower it, there is a slot in this tool here. There's a slot, and then there's a T-handle right here. You're going to insert this T-handle and just rotate it slightly counterclockwise until the platen loosens and starts to drop down a little bit. You only want it to drop down a little bit, because then you don't have to crank it all the way back up, because we don't know how deep this is. Maybe we want to go deeper. So I'm just going to relax this a little bit, and you'll watch it slowly relieve in pressure and slowly drop down. You see that? It dropped down. And then I'm going to tighten it back up. Check that it's tight. When you're done, always loosen till it's all the way down and tighten. So now that it's loose again, I can remove this whole operation and see how much or how little after 8 pumps my piece die formed. So not much at all. And if that's what you want, that's great. My metal did shift around. Do you see that? It shifted slightly off center. So I don't have a symmetrical flange around my piece, which is fine if that's what I want. But now you can see it locks in to position because now it's almost like a puzzle piece. So now you'll have an easier time registering your metal because it sort of locks it into position. So I'm going to re-anneal this. And it's actually pretty soft still. I'm actually going to go for it again. So that means I'm going to load everything back up in here. And you want to make sure everything's lined up perfectly. Load this in again. And this is the part where you want to make sure everything stays how it was. I'm going to load my orange, my 16th of an inch, then my 1/8, then my 1/2 inch, and now I'm going to add the 1 inch of the 115 durometer. I'm going to make sure that's really nice and lined up, and I'm going to start pumping again. Make sure this is locked. You always want to make sure this is locked. So that's righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. So now I can pump up. And it took me 8 pumps to get to that first area. So I'm going to go a little deeper, even though it's not fully annealed now. I'm going to go a little bit more. So 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. All right. Let's see what 17 pumps got us. I'm just going to relieve the pressure a little bit until it falls just enough to have a workable area to slide this back in. And I can take everything out. And we'll see what I have. Dun, 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 dun. There. Now we're getting somewhere. So now I want to go deeper, and in order to go deeper, I've sort of maxed out my urethane here. I keep pumping, and I'm not getting any deeper, which means I've sort of maxed out this urethane's ability to form a deeper area into my metal. So my metal is starting to harden more and more. So I'm going to re-anneal this, and then I'm going to cut pieces of rubber from our rubber drawer. Right here, we have a drawer full of rubber. I'm going to cut pieces of rubber from that rubber drawer, which I have, pieces of inner tube rubber from bicycle tubing, and then I'm also going to put a bunch of my old motorcycle inner tubes in here too. So we're going to cut rubber, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Cut rubber that fits into this area that is going to be basically concentric shapes. And then they're all going to be just layered on top of each other, and then we're going to put this urethane on top of it. Okay, if you're satisfied with your die-formed piece and you have a pair and you feel really good about this being a stopping point, that you don't need to do any more die forming for your piece with this specific die right now, then you have to shut down the tool. So in order to hibernate the tool or to shut it down, you want to release the pressure in the jack. You're going to take again this tool that is slotted, and you're going to put it on this T-valve, and you're going to lefty-loosey, as long as you're done, lower the platen all the way down by releasing all the pressure in the ram. The more you loosen it, the faster it'll go down.
As you can see, this ram is sort of stuck out, and that's because there's air built up in the ram itself, in the jack itself. That is caused from people not relieving the pressure on the jack and leaving it up and under pressure unnecessarily. So similar to the reason we bleed the lines on our acetylene tank, you always want to bleed the pressure out of our hydraulic jack. Otherwise, you do risk damaging the jack. So this does sort of hang out with a little bit of the ram exposed. So you want to make sure that it's at least as low as it can go with all the pressure relieved, and then you can tighten it. Then you're good to go on the jack side, as long as you make sure that you've cleaned the rubber. You want to make sure the rubber is perfectly clean. There's no pieces of metal on it. There's no chunks taken out of it. There's nothing that could actually hurt somebody else's work that's stuck on here. So in the clean drawer, you're going to return all of the clean. Never take a solvent to the urethane, but you're just going to want to wipe it with a clean cloth, and then you can return the rubber to the drawer and close the drawer. Similarly, with the little pieces of rubber, you can return them to the drawer. You could put this in a baggie and hang on to it if you want to recreate this, because you'll end up owning your die, and you can keep the rubber that corresponds with it. But if it's a studio die, like this one is, you can just return the rubber to the drawer in a Ziploc baggie, and then return the die. The die gets returned over here. There's an assortment of successes and failures of dies that have been left behind, and you can go ahead and put them in this drawer. Now that I have my form, I'm going to go ahead and cut it out. And again, strategy is important here. You want to make sure that you have thought about whether you're going to use the flange, how you're going to use it. I'm going to include little tabs on mine. So I'm not going to cut those tabs out completely, because I'm going to use those to secure my piece that I'm going to attach to the other side of this. So I'm going to go ahead and start cutting. Now I have my form. It's got little tabs in it, and I can file it and refine it from here. Okay, so I've just brass brushed this and then liver of sulfured it. So I'm gonna just continue to brass brush this, give it a nice luster on this texture here, and make sure it's nice and dry. And I'm going to take a little bit of steel wool, which there's two kinds out in back by the patina area. There's this really fine steel wool and this more aggressive steel wool. You can kind of see the difference. This one is triple aught, 30000, and this is only single aught, it's 10. So I'm going to use the triple aught, completely dry. Do not use this wet or it will rust. And I'm just going to shine up a little bit more around this textured area to get down to that more coppery color. And then I'm also going to use it on the inside in a circular motion to give me a little different finish on the inside. And then I'm just going to apply a little bit of wax. The wax that we use in the studio is just Johnson's paste wax. You can also use a Renaissance wax, which is a microcrystalline wax. But this stuff works great. So just like Mr. Miyagi taught, the Karate Kid, you wax on and you wax off. So I have a rag here. This is kept in the above cabinet in the patina room. And I'm just gonna dab on a little bit of wax. That's even too much right there. Just a little bit of wax onto this rag. And I'm gonna wax it on the piece. So I'm waxing on. And what it did was it made my metal kind of like a matte finish. And you can see there's some patina actually, or pieces of the steel wool actually kind of coming off. And now, the important part, I'm gonna wax off. It's really important to wax on, wax off. So I'm gonna wax this off by buffing. And it gives it that shine, and it hardens that microcrystalline finish through friction. So it's really, really important to wax on, wax off. So now I have this weird thing I made from the die, and I can tab it or attach it to anything because I included these fixtures in. You might ask, what else can I do with die forming? And there are so many things you can do with die forming. You can collapse objects that you've soldered together. You can squish materials together. You can die form with silver or with copper or brass. You can die form with so many different kinds of materials. You can even heat up acrylic sheet just to a basic operating like flexible temperature, and then hurry up and die form that. You can heat it up either with a heat gun or stick it in a toaster oven for a little while, and when you pull it out, it becomes really, really malleable. You're gonna die form that acrylic sheet, and then you're gonna let it cool in the die. If you don't let it cool in the die, the acrylic sheet has a memory like any plastic, and it'll just go right back to its original flat shape. So if you die form acrylic, don't heat it back up again because it'll just go flat again. So, or at least relatively close to flat again. So, but you could die form any kinds of acrylic sheet. The thinner the better, but usually around 1/16 of an inch die forms really, really great, but also 1/8 of an inch acrylic sheet die forms well too. But it has to be just slightly warm before you throw it in the die.